This episode is in partnership with Authority Magazine. Authority Magazine, a Medium publication, is devoted to sharing in-depth and interesting interviews featuring people who are authorities in business, pop culture, wellness, social impact, and tech. It is a subject that is often discussed but rarely perhaps understood: post-traumatic stress disorder.
Today, we're going to find out what it is, how it's treated, and whether its effects are felt far beyond war zones.
Our guest is clinical psychologist Dr. David Klein, who has worked extensively with Vietnam veterans and others over his quarter century in practice. Well, David, welcome to Believe in People.
Thanks, Kevin and Amy. I so appreciate you having me on.
Listen, you've most recently written a book about the experiences of Vietnam veterans, and the world is in such turmoil at the moment with the situation in Ukraine and the Middle East and elsewhere. I would assume that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is on the minds of many people. What have your studies with those who served in Vietnam told you about this condition?
Well, I think the first thing that it's taught me is that it's a very human and respectable reaction to what happens when you put just ordinary people in extraordinary traumatic circumstances. And that although trauma has been around since the beginning of time, this condition is rather timeless. The Vietnam veterans, I think, essentially put what we know now as PTSD on the map as a socio-political issue, and a clinical issue, but it's been around since the beginning of time. It's just taken on many different names and many different characteristics and concepts, and different cultures have had different ways of describing the wound that we now call PTSD.
And that's actually a great way to say it, the wound. And for our listeners and viewers, David's book is called A Veteran's Toughest Fight, Finding Peace After Vietnam. So I wanted to ask you, David, first, what's your fascination with Vietnam vets? And does one know that they have, this is a completely separate question, but does one know that they have PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah, so let me try to answer the first question first, and then maybe have me get back to the second piece. So my personal interest started literally when I was a kid. Like a lot of young boys, I think I was just fascinated with war and with warriorhood. And that kind of morphed over time. It started with Native American warriors, and then when I became of school age and had access to the library, and I started gaining an interest in all kinds of military history. But I very naturally gravitated to the Vietnam War and have always had a very, as I put it, a visceral and spiritual connection to Vietnam veterans ever since. And I think that's part of what I find compelling about my journey, is that I didn't understand why that was until I progressed much further in my life and could look back on my path. And it seemed exceptionally clear to me that I wound up exactly with the people I was supposed to be with. So that was part of the fascinating process of writing the book for me, is it helped me string together my history and look at how it was interwoven with these veterans that I've dedicated my career to for the last 27 years.
And who are these veterans?
That's what I find so amazing about them, is they are regular, everyday American patriots, I find. These are people who might not necessarily stand out in extraordinary ways. In fact, veterans are often very humble about their service. In fact, a lot of them are so humble they don't even care to talk about it at all. But they come from all over the place, and they came of age during a time not unlike our own in some ways, a very turbulent time culturally, wars, riots, a lot of cultural change going on. And, a lot of them volunteered to go over and do what their country told them was the right thing to do. And so they come from all walks of life. And that's why I find them so down to earth and so interesting and compelling. It's because they're just ordinary, everyday American citizens.
And so, and I guess to go back to that thinking around what, first of all, I guess for our listeners and viewers, I don't want to make an assumption. What is post-traumatic stress disorder, and do we know if we have it? If it, does it have to be based on going to war, or is it, how does
Sure.
that relate?
Yeah, it's a good question, Amy. So again, the concept of PTSD as a clinical or scientific concept is relatively recent. But this knowledge of this wound has been around forever. In fact, some of my favorite authors and one of my favorite psychiatrists wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam, and his name is John Shea, and he essentially did a comparative study of the traumatic wounds of Achilles in the Odyssey and the Iliad, and paralleled that, in fact, to our Vietnam veterans. And it's called Achilles in Vietnam. And so this has been around since the beginning of time. Again, it's become more of a scientific concept of late. And yes, we do have criteria that we define the disorder. So we have a very set way that we can identify symptoms and understand if someone meets criteria for PTSD as we know it. But the fact is that lots of people experience trauma. 1 out of 2 of us in this country will experience a trauma sufficient to produce PTSD. But it comes in lots of shades and colors, and it doesn't always look exactly the same. But yes, you can incur this. We just passed our 9/11 anniversary. That's certainly a national trauma. But all the regular trauma that goes on every day that we see in our news, school shootings, violent crime, sexual assault, childhood abuse, it can come in many different forms and fashions, but it's all essentially the same animal.
I don't know how you just talked about the author and his book. I don't know how familiar or whether or not you're a fan of George Carlin or not, the comedian, the late
Yes.
comedian. And I'm certainly not trying to make light of this disorder. But George Carlin, in one of his acts, describes PTSD by saying that, as you have just said, over time, we've always had it. And in the First World War, it was described as shell shock, and it was quite profound. But as we became militarized and perhaps desensitized to these things in the Second War, it was called battle fatigue. And he said it just like that, and then the audience laughed. And now we've become so desensitized to these sorts of human feelings that it's called post-traumatic stress disorder. And the crowd laughed even more. I guess my point here is are we, because of all the things that you've just listed off to us, school shootings, shootings on highways, bombs going off, terrorism, are we becoming so desensitized to these things that our souls can't take it anymore?
I think that's the paradox, Kevin, is that on one hand, we are certainly desensitized in the sense that we are literally inundated with a constant news cycle that is feeding us images and stories about every form of violence you can imagine. And so we are desensitized in that sense. And yet it's also become part of the American culture. I hear from all kinds of people, yes, it's my PTSD, it's my PTSD. So in some ways, we've kind of popularized the notion. At the same time, we've become increasingly desensitized to images and experiences of violence. So it's just a weird paradox to me, how it can be both.
And actually, to your point, you just meant, I was going to ask you, how does this manifest if you mention 1 out of 2, that is unbelievable. So how does that, okay, apart from violence, how does this manifest with us? How do we walk around and deal with this, knowing that it is this desensitized experience that we're going through?
Yeah, so while almost all, like I said, half of us are exposed to a trauma of sufficient gravity to cause the disorder, um, clinically and statistically, what we see is that it's a relative minority of even trauma-exposed people who go on to develop what we call PTSD. And that's for a variety of reasons that we're, still trying to figure out. But at the same time, a lot of the people carry trauma around and they engage in what clinicians like to call spontaneous recovery, or they can often get better without any professional intervention, medications, or psychotherapy. And they might just do so through family support. They might do so through their faith. And there's lots of different ways that people are actually very resilient. And yet we're also fragile at the same time. So there's lots of people out there carrying trauma around, both healed and unhealed. And I think certainly for me, it's something that's I always keep in my mind when you come across someone who has what might seem to be an overreaction to something. It's like you never know what someone's walking around with.
Right.
When you discussed or talked about the fact that so many of our veterans are just ordinary Americans, just like our next door neighbors or the folks down the street or what have you, we hear so much about homeless veterans, veterans who've turned to alcohol or drug abuse. Where I'm even talking about Gulf War veterans when we talk about this. What is the the sort of support mechanism that's out there? Because clearly, a lot of these people can't deal with this stress or trauma themselves, whether their family can help them or it's so too serious, whether their church can or can't. And they do end up turning to other forms that are not particularly helpful to them. And a lot of them end up on the street.
Yeah. So, certainly there's services that are offered both through the government in the form of the VA and in the private sector to address trauma. But most people, by definition, because avoidance of their pain is literally built into the condition, it is part of the criteria for PTSD. The very thing that they need to heal is what they tend to avoid the most. And so people will go to great lengths to avoid their pain. We see this all over the culture. We're riddled with addictions of all types. And so we're very adept at trying to avoid our pain and the core of the problem. So people turn to all kinds of things. One of the things that I try to make clear in my book, and I wrote my book for veterans and as a devotional specifically to Vietnam veterans, the one thing that I try to appeal to is, and this is a somewhat ambitious target audience, is I wrote it for the country. And what I wanted to do was appeal to the community, to the civilian community in particular, that these folks that went and fought and incurred trauma on our behalf, they need our help. And there's kind of a fancy clinical term for it. It's called communalization. But it's just simply the idea that we need one another to heal. We need the community to help heal people. And the way that we currently do this, which is tradition in Western cultures, is we stick them in a room with a professional like myself, close the door, pledge confidentiality, and try to work that pain of the trauma out in secrecy. The whole idea of communalization is utilizing the culture, the community, to share the burden and to listen to what these people have to teach us. And it's been around forever. People have been healing in community circles since the beginning of time. And there's an ancient wisdom there that I appeal to the country. Like they need us and we need them. We keep sending people to war and wondering why they come back with problems. And part of that problem is because they are left to carry the burden by themselves. And frankly, it should be on the shoulders of all of us in whose names they were sent to fight.
Yeah, wow. That's so well said, David. And I want to ask you, in your book, you talk about the importance of finding peace. So what are some of the strategies or practices what do you think are most effective for building resilience?
Well, building resilience and finding peace might be two sides of the same coin. But again, I'll go back to the idea of communal healing. In my circles, what we do is we call that group therapy. Although there are other cultures that have done this since the beginning of time, and utilize the community in groups to engage in storytelling and listening to heal the community. I'll just briefly mention this. There's a wonderful documentary that was made in 2011 called Fambletok. It's a film by Sarah Terry, and what it does is it details the aftermath of the 10-year civil war in Sierra Leone. And it's about the community basically rallying around a national program to bring the communities together and to bring perpetrators and victims together and to have communal sessions of truth telling of trauma, and to also follow that up with forgiveness and reconciliation. So that's a kind of an example of utilizing the entire community. I don't have that kind of access, nor do we have the cultural support really to do that. So I do that in group therapy behind closed doors with veterans. And what I think the healing comes from is finding other people who, and veterans use this vernacular, who get it. Okay. In veterans worlds, there's people who get it and there's people who don't. And the people who get it are those who have had experiences, who have been through the underworld and have been through an ordeal and have been scathed by it, and have something to give one another. That there's something that survivors can give one another that is very difficult for people who don't understand or have not been traumatized. So people who know of war can speak to war and can support each other in ways that is frankly amazing and just magical to participate in. So that's part of the way that that I try to bring healing to my veterans. And there's many stories in the book that outline various examples of that. Amy asked me the question about healing and resilience. I think that's part of the therapeutic task whenever one goes into psychotherapy, but especially for trauma, is recasting your life and integrating the pain, not running away from it, and creating meaning and purpose that incorporates the traumatic event, right? Because you can't erase it, you can't look away from it, you can't ignore it, because it's like that old axiom that dragons only chase you when you run. So part of it is to stop running and to deal with the trauma and to create new meaning and purpose with that being a part of your life narrative, instead of trying to get back to who they were before.
So what are you saying? That people heal from talking through their experiences, sharing their experiences with others who get it, who understand what they have gone through. They're not alone, so to speak.
Yes, precisely. So telling one's story, giving testimony, again, has been an ancient practice. I mean, going back to Shakespeare, and a lot of those actors were actually war veterans who would come back and put on plays and share part of what they knew with the community through drama, right, and through Greek tragedy. So being able to share one's story is a critical ingredient in that, as one of my mentors is fond of saying, Dr. Tick, who actually wrote my foreword. In order to restore, we must restory. In other words, the person must be able to restore themselves through telling their stories to an empathic listener, and being able to witness that. story. And again, it shares the burden. Another axiom of group that I like is pain shared is pain divided.
That's really interesting. So, David, a question for you. What gaps do you, I mean, I appreciate the fact that we've evolved over the years and we understand perhaps PTSD a little bit better, but what gaps still exist in our, that we haven't addressed in our society?
That's a very good question, Amy. And I think the way I would answer it is by, again, pointing to this idea of utilizing the power of the community rather than, again, having select people in the community, whether that be the Veterans Department of Veterans Affairs, private sector therapists, and clergy, frankly, are the three groups who really bear kind of the burden and the responsibility of trying to help heal as many people as we can. And certainly we help lots of people, but I think the untapped power is really in the civilian community. And so that's where I certainly would like to see us advance to. Ironically, advance by going back to ancient healing practices that have been practiced since the beginning of time in circles, whether it be Native American circles with warriors coming back from battle, or anything else. It's just a practice that's been time tested, and it's still what we're missing.
Well, what do you think then? Let me take you back. We've been mentioning community a lot here all of a sudden, and I want to ask you this question point blank. What is your diagnosis of our state of community these days? Because it strikes me as if more and more people are being siloed off. That's a nice modern buzzword that somebody else created. Siloed off into their own little worlds, in their own little houses, looking at their own little screens, and they don't even know who lives next door to them. That's not a new phenomenon, but it exists.
Yes. Yeah, precisely. Again, another paradox, Kevin, is that we are more interconnected in some ways by technology than ever. And yet the social bonds that hold us together has, in my opinion, atrophied significantly.
Oh.
We've never been so connected and so alone all at the same time.
Yeah.
And that you throw in a veteran into this mix, someone who has experienced death in front of them or what have you. Who are they supposed to talk to? A screen,
Precisely. Yeah.
Huh.
I know. David, one thing that really fascinated me was your talk about your journey to this point of treating veterans. What was the thread? What was that sort of message to you based on all of your experiences? And you thought, aha, this is what I need to do?
So that's another thing that I explore in my book, because part of the book was my attempt to put together my journey and understand where I've come from and how I got to where I am. Again, it started as a kid with just my interests. And then, of course, when it came time to look at college, and I was interested in psychology from a fairly young age, kind of mid-teens. And I ended up eventually going to graduate school and my thought was I would do what most people who graduated with their doctoral degree in psychology would do, which is to hang a shingle and go into private practice. And as I'm fond of telling people, I eventually did do that part-time currently, but I took a 27-year detour through the VA. And that 27-year detour was because I had not, for whatever reason, put together that those were the people I was destined to be with. And I like to say also,
how do you know? That's what I'm passionate about. How did you know that though these were your people?
So one of my rotations, I was invited to be a part of these PTSD groups that was run by a therapist. And I walked into my first group, and it was filled with Vietnam veterans, quiet and staring at the new presence in the room. And I sat down, and I was in that group for an hour and a half, and it was an evening group. And two things happened. Number one, I sobbed the entire way home. on my commute. I was so profoundly moved, and it was so deep, I couldn't even tell where it was coming from. So that was one thing. And the other thing that occurred to me is I looked at that man running that group and what was happening in there. And I said, I want to do what that guy's doing.
Wow.
I want to do what he's doing someday. And I did. And since that time, I've led over 5,000 PTSD groups with Vietnam veterans. I've
Wow.
had thousands of countless hours with them. And I have just always felt like they were my people. And that connection just feels far more than intellectual. It's a heart connection.
So what takes place within the group of Vietnam veterans in one of these sessions? Do you see how is someone like me supposed to describe it? Do you see a little bit of light at the end of a tunnel? What is it? Do they open up? Do they find a brother, perhaps?
All of that, Kevin. I mean, again, the paradox of going to the absolute darkest places that one can go, and the paradox of finding light somewhere in there is just the gravity of that. Just I never get tired of it. It's truly something magical to be a part of.
And
And
are they
so
changed?
it's what's that?
Are they changed?
They meaning the veterans?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think again, part of what I have as testimony and the stories in my book, I think speaks to the process of change and healing that can happen when, again, people come together with others who have walked a mile in their boots, so to speak, and share deeply and are fully engaged and present. And then there's some kind of magic that also happens in there, which is truly hard to quantify or wrap my hands around. And that's what has kept me so engaged all these years. I never tire of it.
A Veteran's Toughest Fight, Finding Peace After Vietnam, Dr. David Klein. So make sure you pick up that book. David, it's available everywhere?
Yeah, everywhere online. It's published by McFarlane, and Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I don't know that it's on shelves anywhere, as libraries are their primary constituency, but it's available on all the major websites that sell books.
Wonderful.
Just before each week, we ask the same question of our guest, and Amy will be asking it today. But before she does, because I can hear that we're starting to wrap this up, I want to sneak one in. And that is, and I'm saying this as someone who has covered war zones in his career, because I have, in our society, in our world, we all love to go to war movies. We all like to watch movies, Saving Private Ryan or what have you. Audie Murphy was a hero of mine when I was a young boy. World War II's most decorated soldier, what have you, John Wayne. We all go to see these things, but there really is a separation between that and my two grandfathers who fought in the trenches of World War I. There is a separation there. And I guess my question is it up to the veterans who have seen these things to tell us what it's all about? Or is it up to us to reach out to them to see if they could perhaps educate us a little bit more about what war is really like? Because it isn't Hollywood.
Sure. I would say it's more the latter, Kevin. I don't feel veterans owe us anything. They have already paid in ways that many of us can't even imagine. So I do put the responsibility and the onus primarily on us. Right now, it's kind of like don't ask, don't tell. We don't ask and they don't tell. And I feel like it's incumbent upon us to want to know that we can't just send people to war and simply then ignore the aftermath of that because our troops are home. That's not the end of their war. It's just the end of the war we see on TV. So, but yes, I think it's very much incumbent upon us to to initiate that. And then again, that's part of the reason I wrote the book, is to reach out to civilian America and say, we need them just as much as they need us.
Yeah. And so you have such a heart, a soulful place for veterans, and with us mere civilians, not mere, but our civilians. Why do you still believe in people?
I believe in people precisely because of what these veterans have taught me. Again, as I said, I think at the beginning of our discussion today, that these are, no one goes into the military to try to become a hero, though people go in for lots of reasons. But again, the vast majority of these people are simply everyday, ordinary Americans that we ask to do extraordinary things for us and place them in extraordinary circumstances and ask them literally at such a young age, most of the time, to risk everything. And who amongst us does that?
Right.
Our veterans do. So one of the things that makes me believe in people is that I see this every day and I hear about these stories every day. And so they renew my faith in what people are capable of doing, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. I would answer that in a more general way, too, that I believe in people because all of us are simply on this planet just trying to find our way. And in this life and in this world, and a key part to finding this path for ourselves, I believe, is through helping others. And so when we help others, we help ourselves. And that's certainly been part of my journey. I would have never had the opportunity to learn about myself without these veterans holding up the very largest of mirrors for me.
Wow.
David Klein, thank you very much. And thank you very much for sharing a part of our community that we often either overlook or look away from. Thank you very much for being on Believe in People.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, David. One thing that struck me was we all have to find our way, and community, and we fall very short in that department, is to build a sort of a community circle. And so the takeaway is to sort of pay more attention to what David said and the need for us to all find our way through community and to engage more rather than sort of isolate ourselves. I think that's the support that we all need.
Well, of course, my takeaway is perhaps we shouldn't have any more wars, but in this day and
Yeah.
age, I'm kind of figuring out that that's not going to be happening. But at least if we were going to send a younger generation in somewhere to fight these fights on our behalf, we should at least have something planned for when these the damaged ones come home.
Yeah.
If you found or find this community, Believe in People, something that you want to belong to, please subscribe to our podcast, Believe in People, or listen in again next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.